Today, we're going to talk about something incredibly powerful, something that sits at the intersection of neuroscience, psychology, and personal transformation. The topic is how to start a new life. Now, that might sound like a vague or even overwhelming idea, but I want to assure you it's not just possible. It's biologically designed to happen if you know how to work with the systems already built into your brain and body. Your nervous system isn't just a recording of your past. It's a tool for shaping your future. And the latest science shows us that at any point, regardless of age, history, or circumstance, we can rewire our thoughts, reorient our behavior, and redefine our identity. So today, we'll explore how real, lasting change starts not with wishful thinking, but with understanding how your brain responds to challenge, novelty, and choice. You'll walk away with tools, not just ideas. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change its structure and function in response to experience, and it is the foundation for starting a new life. This concept is not theoretical, it's biological fact. For decades, scientists believed that the adult brain was relatively fixed, that after a certain age we simply became who we are and stayed that way. But now we know that's not true. The brain is continuously remodeling itself in response to how we think, act, and feel. And the most exciting part, you can direct that remodeling process. You can literally teach your brain to become someone new. When we talk about neuroplasticity, we're talking about the reconfiguration of neural circuits pathways in the brain that determine how we perceive the world, how we respond to challenges, how we manage emotion, and how we form habits. These circuits are not set in stone. They can be pruned, strengthened, weakened, or built anew depending on how we engage with our environment. Starting a new life means initiating a new set of patterns in the brain. It means becoming conscious of the fact that our default mode, our automatic behaviors, and thought loops are simply the result of previous repetitions. They are not who we are, they are what we've practiced. The key to leveraging neuroplasticity is to understand the conditions under which it occurs most effectively. First, the brain changes most readily during periods of intense focus and attention. When you direct your mind to a new idea or action with deep concentration, your brain flags that experience as important. That heightened state triggers the release of neuromodulators like acetylcholine and norepinephrine, which act like spotlight chemicals. They mark specific synapses for change. What this means practically is that you don't need to change everything at once. You need to change a few things with intention and intensity. Second, the process of neuroplasticity is not immediate. The actual rewiring happens during periods of rest and sleep. When you push yourself into a new behavior, whether it's getting up early, resisting an old habit, or taking a new risk, the physical change in the brain doesn't happen during the effort. It happens after, when you're asleep, especially in deep sleep and REM. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. A single experience can initiate plasticity, but repetition locks it in. So if you're starting a new life, you don't have to be perfect every day, but you do have to keep showing up. Third, emotions play a critical role. Experiences that are emotionally charged, whether positive or negative, create stronger changes in the brain. This is why people remember traumatic events or joyful breakthroughs so vividly. The emotional salience tells the brain this matters, keep it. You can use this principle to your advantage. If you tie new habits or identities to emotional experiences, such as the pride you feel after a workout, the sense of freedom after saying no to something toxic, or the curiosity sparked by learning something new, you increase the likelihood that the brain will encode those behaviors. There's also the concept of limbic friction, something Dr. Huberman often refers to. This is the resistance you feel when you try to do something new or difficult. It's a neurobiological reality. The brain, being an energy-conserving organ, is biased toward familiar patterns. So when you initiate a new behavior, you will almost certainly feel discomfort, hesitation, or self-doubt. That friction isn't a sign you're doing it wrong. It's a sign the brain is being asked to rewire. Leaning into limbic friction, rather than avoiding it, is what signals the brain to pay attention and prepare to change. Another important factor is deliberate practice. This concept, grounded in neuroscience, states that plasticity is most effective when you are actively correcting errors. Simply going through the motions does not create meaningful change. When you consciously detect what isn't working and try to improve it, your brain is more likely to reorganize the circuitry involved. That's why feedback, whether internal or external, is so essential. When you reflect on your actions, adjust your approach, and stay engaged with the process, You're accelerating your own neural adaptation. Novelty is a powerful driver of plasticity. When you expose yourself to new environments, new ideas, new people, or new challenges, the brain lights up in different areas. Novelty increases dopamine, which not only enhances motivation but also primes the brain for learning. Starting a new life requires you to step into unfamiliar territory not just physically, but mentally. Doing things differently, even in small ways, taking a new route to work, changing your morning routine, reading new types of books can all trigger the brain to break out of old loops and prepare for new ones. Neuroplasticity, therefore, isn't a magical process, it's a biological mechanism governed by very specific rules. Focus, repetition, emotion, novelty, and rest are its primary ingredients. If you engage with these intentionally, you can reshape who you are at the most fundamental level. When people think about starting a new life, they often imagine making a massive change, a sudden transformation, a complete overhaul of who they are. The problem with that mindset is that it sets the brain and body up for failure. Biologically speaking, the human nervous system is not designed for radical, all-at-once shifts. It's designed for incremental adaptation. The brain relies on repetition and predictability to build habits and reinforce identity. This means that small, repetitive actions done consistently are far more effective than trying to change everything at once. The reason is simple. These smaller actions fit within the bandwidth of what your nervous system can handle without triggering overwhelm, resistance, or burnout. When you repeat a behavior, even if it's very small, you create a neural pathway associated with that action. The more often you engage in that behavior, the more efficient that pathway becomes. This is because of a basic principle in neuroscience: neurons that fire together wire together. The brain is constantly trying to become more efficient by strengthening the connections between actions that are repeated. Over time, these repeated actions require less conscious effort. They become habits, and those habits become identity. This is the key mechanism for sustainable long-term change. Take something as simple as drinking a glass of water first thing in the morning. On its own, that doesn't seem like a life-changing behavior. But what it does is signal to your brain that you are a person who takes care of yourself. If you follow that with 5 minutes of stretching or deep breathing, that small routine now becomes a neural anchor for a different kind of day. The key is not the magnitude of the action, it's the consistency. It's doing the same foundational thing every day until it becomes automatic. Once it's automatic, you can layer the next behavior. This is called habit stacking, and it's incredibly effective at leveraging the brain's reward systems to encourage further change. There's also a deep psychological effect that comes from small, repeated wins. Each time you follow through on a small action, you reinforce a sense of agency. You prove to yourself that you have control over your behavior. That sense of agency is one of the most powerful motivators we have. It shifts your internal narrative from "I can't change" to "I am already changing." And because the brain keeps a record of wins and losses, these small successes accumulate and begin to outweigh the old self-doubt patterns that may have previously held you back. This ties into the science of dopamine, which is not just the molecule of pleasure, but also of motivation and reward prediction. When you set a small goal and achieve it, your brain releases dopamine. That dopamine creates a feedback loop that makes it more likely you'll repeat the behavior. Over time, the brain begins to anticipate that same reward, and that anticipation becomes its own source of motivation. By setting small, achievable targets and hitting them consistently, you are literally training your brain to want to keep going. You don't need to feel a surge of willpower every day. You need to feel a little bit of success. Another advantage of small, repetitive actions is that they allow you to adapt without triggering excessive stress. The body and brain respond to perceived threats with a stress response: elevated cortisol, narrowed attention, increased vigilance. When you try to change too much too quickly, your system can interpret that as a threat, especially if it disrupts your sense of identity or comfort. But small changes bypass that alarm system. They fly under the radar. They allow you to build momentum without inviting your inner critic to step in and sabotage the process. Your identity doesn't feel like it's being attacked, it feels like it's being slowly upgraded. It's also important to understand that repetition doesn't mean mindless repetition. The most effective habits are those that are repeated with presence and intention. When you bring awareness to what you're doing, whether it's journaling, exercising, or simply sitting in silence, you activate higher-level brain regions that help encode those experiences more deeply. The more deliberate you are in your actions, the more you engage with the neuroplastic mechanisms that actually change your brain. Even if the action is small, your presence makes it powerful. The consistency of small actions also allows for error correction and resilience. When you set a massive goal and fall short, it's easy to abandon the entire process. But when your actions are small, there's room for imperfection. Missing one day doesn't derail your identity. You simply return to the action the next day. This builds psychological flexibility and emotional endurance, two qualities that are essential for sustainable life change. It also builds trust within yourself because you're no longer relying on bursts of inspiration. You're relying on structure, process, and consistency, which the brain interprets as safety and stability. Small, repetitive actions give you control over the most valuable resource you have, your attention. By focusing on a narrow set of intentional behaviors, you train your brain to prioritize what matters. You reduce cognitive load, minimize distractions, and align your actions with your desired future self. This is how true transformation begins, not with dramatic gestures, but with quiet, steady movement in a new direction. Stress is often seen as something to avoid, something negative, something harmful. But from a neuroscience perspective, stress is not inherently bad. In fact, it is a key driver of growth and adaptation. When harnessed correctly, stress can serve as a powerful catalyst for change. The brain and body are designed to respond to stress by becoming stronger, more focused, and more resilient. This process is built into our biology through systems that evolve to help us survive, adapt, and thrive in unpredictable environments. The challenge is not to eliminate stress, but to understand it, work with it, and use it strategically. At the core of the stress response is the autonomic nervous system, which includes the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. The sympathetic branch is responsible for activating alertness, energy, and readiness in the face of a challenge. It increases heart rate, boosts blood flow to the muscles, and sharpens attention. This is often referred to as the fight or flight response, but it's more than just a survival mechanism. It's a performance-enhancing state that allows you to rise to a challenge, confront difficulty, and move forward with intensity. The presence of stress can actually amplify focus and learning when it is balanced and contained within a manageable range. The key is in how we interpret and respond to stress. When stress is viewed as a threat, the brain's prefrontal cortex responsible for decision-making, planning, and emotional regulation begins to shut down. But when stress is viewed as a challenge, something to be met with effort and curiosity, those same prefrontal circuits remain online. This mindset shift changes the neurochemical profile of the stress response. Instead of triggering only cortisol and fear-based reactions, the brain begins to release dopamine and adrenaline in a way that supports action, persistence, and even motivation. There's a concept in neuroscience called hormesis. It refers to the idea that small doses of stress actually improve biological systems. When you expose the body or brain to a mild challenge like cold exposure, intense exercise, or focused effort, it responds by strengthening itself. This is because systems that are challenged adapt. Muscle gets stronger after resistance. Memory improves after effortful recall. Emotional regulation improves after facing discomfort. When you deliberately place yourself in situations that are difficult but not overwhelming, you create the ideal conditions for growth. The stress becomes a signal not of danger but of potential. This is especially important when trying to start a new life. Any kind of meaningful change will introduce discomfort. You will face resistance from old habits, uncertainty about the future, and fear of failure. This is normal. What matters is how you relate to that discomfort. If you interpret it as a sign that you're on the wrong path, you may retreat. But if you recognize it as a necessary phase of adaptation, you can lean into it with purpose. You can treat stress as a training ground, a place where your nervous system is learning to function under new conditions. Cognitive and emotional resilience are built through repeated exposure to manageable stressors. This is sometimes called stress inoculation. By gradually increasing your exposure to challenging situations, whether that's public speaking, difficult conversations, or disciplined routines, you teach your brain that it can survive and succeed under pressure. This doesn't mean pushing yourself to the point of breakdown. It means finding that edge where you are just outside your comfort zone, where the stakes are real but not paralyzing. That edge is where change occurs. That's where new neural connections are formed, new patterns are created, and new capacities are revealed. On a biochemical level, moderate stress triggers the release of neuromodulators like norepinephrine and epinephrine, which increase alertness, attention, and memory formation. These chemicals make the brain more plastic, more capable of change during and immediately after the stressor. This is why peak experiences, even when uncomfortable, are often the most transformative. They create strong emotional and sensory impressions that the brain tags as significant. By directing your effort and awareness in those moments, you can shape how those impressions are encoded and what meaning is attached to them. There's also the relationship between stress and motivation. Dopamine, the molecule associated with drive and goal pursuit, is often released not in the moment of success, but in the anticipation of overcoming a challenge. This means that if you frame stress as part of the journey towards something meaningful, your brain will actually reward you for stepping into it. The discomfort becomes associated with forward movement, with possibility, and with growth. This reinforces a feedback loop in which effort becomes energizing rather than depleting. The brain loves patterns, and it quickly learns to associate certain internal states with certain outcomes. If every time you experience stress, you retreat or shut down, your nervous system begins to interpret stress as a cue for avoidance. But if you meet stress with action, curiosity, or calm, you teach your brain that stress is survivable and even useful. Over time, you become less reactive and more responsive. You build what researchers call stress resilience, which is the ability to maintain clarity, focus, and intention under pressure. Environment has a profound effect on behavior. It shapes not only what we do, but also how we think, feel, and even who we believe we are. The human brain is constantly scanning for cues from the external world to determine what is safe, what is important, and what behaviors are appropriate. This means that if you want to start a new life, one of the most overlooked yet powerful places to begin is your environment. The physical spaces you occupy, the people you interact with, the sounds, smells, and even lighting around you all send signals to your nervous system that either support your desired changes or reinforce old patterns. From a neuroscience perspective, the brain is highly sensitive to context. Context tells the brain what neural circuits to activate. When you enter a room that you've always associated with procrastination, stress, or distraction, the brain retrieves those behavioral patterns almost automatically. This is because the hippocampus, which is involved in memory, works closely with the environment to tag behaviors with locations. When you change your environment, even in small ways, you begin to disrupt those automatic associations. This disruption is key to rewiring behavior because it creates space for new patterns to emerge. Designing your environment with intention means looking closely at the signals you're sending yourself every day. What do you see when you wake up? What do you hear throughout the day? What objects are always within reach? These seemingly trivial details have an outsized impact on behavior. For instance, if you keep your phone next to your bed, the likelihood of starting your day with distraction is far higher than if your phone is in another room. If your kitchen counter is covered in processed food, you are far more likely to default to unhealthy eating choices. These defaults are not a failure of willpower, they are the predictable result of environmental design. There's a principle in behavioral science that says, make the desired behavior easy and the undesired behavior hard. This applies directly to your environment. If you want to read more, leave a book where you usually sit. If you want to meditate, create a quiet space with minimal sensory input. If you want to write or create, eliminate visual clutter that competes for attention. Your brain has limited bandwidth for decision-making, and every friction point, every unnecessary distraction or obstacle uses up energy. By removing those points of friction from your environment, you free up cognitive resources to focus on what matters. Social environment is equally important. Human behavior is highly influenced by social norms and group dynamics. The people you surround yourself with either expand or limit your sense of possibility. The brain uses a system of mirror neurons to simulate the experiences of others. When you are around people who embody the qualities you want to develop, discipline, courage, curiosity, kindness, your brain begins to adopt those patterns through observation and imitation. This is why community, mentorship, and accountability are such powerful tools for transformation. They don't just inspire you, they rewire you. Emotional regulation is also deeply affected by environment. Your nervous system responds to sensory input with changes in heart rate, breathing, and hormonal levels. For example, natural light can improve mood and sleep by regulating your circadian rhythm. A cluttered or chaotic space can elevate cortisol, the stress hormone, making it harder to focus and feel calm. On the other hand, order, beauty, and nature can activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the system responsible for relaxation and recovery. When your environment is aligned with your nervous system's needs, it becomes a supportive container for growth rather than a source of resistance. There's also the concept of environmental priming. This refers to how your surroundings can subtly cue certain behaviors without conscious awareness. A desk with a notepad and pen may prime you to write. A clean kitchen may prime you to cook. These cues work because the brain is constantly predicting what should happen next based on what it sees. If you deliberately place objects, reminders, or tools in your environment that align with your goals, you increase the likelihood of following through on those goals without needing excessive mental effort. Starting a new life often requires distancing yourself from environments that reinforce your old identity. This doesn't always mean moving to a new city or cutting ties with everyone you know, although sometimes that may be necessary. More often, it means making small but consistent changes to the places you spend your time. Creating boundaries, rearranging spaces, and curating your digital environment all count. What you consume online, the tone of conversations you participate in, and the types of media you expose yourself to are all part of your broader environment. They shape your mindset, your attention, and ultimately your identity. Environmental change also works synergistically with internal change. When you modify your surroundings to reflect the person you want to become, your brain receives that feedback as validation. It starts to believe the change is real. This is known as embodied cognition, the idea that the body and environment inform the mind, not just the other way around. You can use this principle to reinforce new habits by creating an environment that mirrors your intentions. In doing so, you reduce internal resistance because the external world begins to support the internal transformation. The way you speak to yourself shapes your identity, your decisions, and your future. Internal dialogue is not just a background noise in your mind, it is a set of instructions that your brain and body respond to. The human nervous system listens carefully to thoughts, even if they are subtle or habitual. Every time you tell yourself that you're not good enough, that you always fail, or that change is too hard, you reinforce neural pathways that make those beliefs feel more real. Over time, those thoughts become identity-level beliefs, and once something becomes part of your identity, the brain will defend it, even if it's harmful. The brain doesn't easily distinguish between thought and reality. When you visualize something vividly or repeat an idea often, your brain encodes it as experience. This is due to the way the prefrontal cortex interacts with memory systems in the hippocampus and emotional processing centers like the amygdala. If you constantly say to yourself, "I can't do this," your brain hears that as fact and begins to suppress creative problem solving, risk-taking, and motivation. In contrast, if your inner dialogue includes phrases like "I'm learning how to do this" or "this is hard, but I'm capable," the brain engages different circuits, those associated with effort, adaptation, and resilience. This isn't just motivational theory. It's rooted in neuroplasticity. The brain changes in response to experience, and internal dialogue is one of the most consistent experiences you have. Your self-talk becomes the soundtrack of your life. If that soundtrack is harsh, critical, or hopeless, your internal world becomes one of contraction and fear. If it is encouraging, honest, and focused on growth, your internal world becomes one of expansion and possibility. The way you talk to yourself sets the tone for how you interpret setbacks, how you approach goals, and how you handle uncertainty. Another layer to this is how self-talk regulates your physiological state. When your thoughts are self-critical or defeatist, they can activate the body's stress response. Cortisol rises, heart rate increases, and your capacity for creative or long-term thinking diminishes. You enter a survival state even if there's no external danger. On the other hand, when your internal dialogue is compassionate and constructive, it helps activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the one responsible for calm, rest, and repair. Your body feels safer. Your brain becomes more open to learning. This safety is a necessary condition for change because when the nervous system feels threatened, it prioritizes preservation over transformation. Intentional self-talk is a tool you can use to train your nervous system. Like any skill, it requires practice. It begins with awareness, catching the automatic phrases you repeat to yourself. These often come up during moments of challenge, failure, or transition. Listen carefully to what you say in those moments. That is your current script. Once you become aware of the script, you can begin to challenge and revise it, not with blind positivity, but with honest, empowering language that supports forward movement. Saying "I'm such a failure" can be replaced with "this didn't go the way I wanted, but I'm capable of learning from it." Language has weight in the nervous system. Certain words carry emotional charge and create physiological shifts. Words like never, always, can't, and should tend to create rigidity and pressure. Words like experiment, practice, progress, and explore create openness and flexibility. By choosing your words intentionally, even in your inner world, you guide your nervous system toward a more adaptive state. This doesn't mean ignoring difficult emotions. It means creating language that helps you stay engaged rather than shutting down. There's also the role of visualization in reinforcing positive self-talk. When you pair encouraging language with vivid mental imagery, the brain responds with a stronger signal. This is because the visual cortex and motor planning areas light up in response to imagined scenarios almost as strongly as they do during real ones. If you tell yourself, I am capable of change, and at the same time visualize yourself following through on new habits, having the conversations you've been avoiding, or showing up fully in your new identity, your brain encodes that sequence as something familiar, and familiarity reduces fear. In moments of stress or self-doubt, your inner dialogue becomes a bridge between your current state and your desired state. When you don't know what to do, when motivation is low, or when setbacks happen, your inner voice determines whether you spiral or stabilize. A useful practice is to develop a set of phrases that are both realistic and supportive words that you can return to when you feel lost. These can act as neural anchors, pulling your attention back toward grounded effort and self-respect. They don't need to be dramatic or poetic. They need to be believable and repeatable. The more consistently you use intentional self-talk, the more natural it becomes. At first, it might feel artificial, especially if your internal voice has been critical for years. But repetition builds fluency. Each time you choose words that support growth, you lay down new wiring in the brain. Over time, this becomes the default. You move from needing to fight old narratives to simply not feeding them. Your energy goes toward building, not repairing. And as that internal voice evolves, so does your identity, because the story you tell yourself becomes the story you live. Accountability is a fundamental element of any meaningful transformation. When you decide to start a new life, the commitment you make to yourself is powerful, but it can also be fragile without external reinforcement. The human brain is wired for social connection and feedback. We are deeply influenced by the expectations, observations, and reactions of others. Accountability taps into this neurobiological truth by creating a social contract, one that engages reward circuits, strengthens motivation, and builds consistency in ways that internal resolve alone often cannot achieve. At the neural level, accountability activates brain regions involved in social cognition, such as the medial prefrontal cortex and the temporoparietal junction. These areas are responsible for how we perceive others' thoughts, intentions, and judgments. When you know someone else is aware of your goals or actions, your brain anticipates social evaluation. This anticipation can increase focus, effort, and follow-through because the brain values social approval and connection. In essence, accountability turns private goals into public commitments, which leverages the brain's natural tendency toward social conformity and reciprocity. The dopamine system also plays a critical role in accountability. When you share your progress with someone else, whether it's a friend, coach, or community, you create moments of positive reinforcement. Praise, recognition, or even just acknowledgement trigger dopamine release, which enhances motivation and learning. This neurochemical feedback loop makes it easier to sustain behavior over time because the brain starts to associate effort with social reward. It shifts the experience of discipline from a burdensome chore to a valued interaction that brings pleasure and meaning. Accountability provides structure and rhythm to change efforts. Starting a new life is a complex process with many moving parts, and without some form of external framework, it's easy to lose momentum. Regular check-ins, whether daily, weekly, or monthly, create predictable points for reflection and recalibration. These checkpoints help maintain awareness of progress and obstacles, allowing for adjustments in strategy before discouragement sets in. The brain thrives on such predictable rhythms, which reduce uncertainty and increase a sense of control, a key factor in sustained motivation. There is also a psychological dimension to accountability that supports emotional resilience. Knowing that someone else is invested in your journey helps buffer against feelings of isolation and self-doubt. Change is often accompanied by setbacks, moments of frustration, and vulnerability. Having an accountability partner creates a safe container for these experiences. It allows for shared problem-solving, encouragement, and validation, which are crucial for maintaining emotional balance. This social support helps prevent the stress response from becoming overwhelming, which otherwise might trigger relapse or abandonment of goals. The nature of accountability can vary widely from formal arrangements like coaching or therapy to informal setups like accountability buddies or online communities. Each type engages the brain differently, but serves the same basic purpose: to externalize commitment and create social consequences for actions. In formal settings, the clarity of roles, expectations, and consequences can increase the sense of responsibility and seriousness. Informal arrangements rely more on mutual trust and empathy, but often provide flexibility and emotional connection that formal systems lack. Understanding your own personality and needs can help you choose the most effective form of accountability for your transformation. Another important aspect is the element of transparency that accountability encourages. When you regularly report your progress, challenges, and feelings, you increase self-awareness. This practice activates the brain's metacognitive functions, improving your ability to monitor your own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. The feedback loop created by transparency not only enhances external accountability, but also strengthens internal accountability. You become more honest with yourself about what's working and what's not, which is essential for adaptive change. Accountability also helps combat common cognitive biases that can undermine transformation efforts. For example, optimism bias may lead you to underestimate the challenges ahead or overestimate your ability to stick with new habits. Confirmation bias might cause you to ignore signs that a strategy isn't working. Having someone else involved in your process introduces an external perspective that can counteract these distortions. This external check reduces blind spots, enhances problem solving, and keeps your goals aligned with reality. Importantly, accountability fosters a sense of purpose and meaning. When you share your intentions with others, you invite them to become part of your story. This connection transforms abstract goals into relational commitments. It deepens your investment because you are no longer only accountable to yourself, but also to a community or individual who cares. The social dimension of accountability provides emotional fuel that sustains long-term perseverance, especially during moments when intrinsic motivation might wane. Finally, accountability supports the development of identity. As you repeatedly demonstrate to others and to yourself that you can follow through, you build a track record that becomes part of your self-concept. Your brain encodes this history of success and reliability as evidence of who you are. Over time, these socialized experiences help solidify a new identity aligned with your desired life. The shift from "I want to change" to "I am someone who follows through" is a critical step in creating lasting transformation because identity is the foundation upon which all behavior is organized.